There is a specific kind of cold that only exists in the high Sierras during the late autumn months. It is the type of chill that ignores your warming layers and settles directly into the marrow of your bones. At the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California, that cold is your only constant companion. When you are operating at 8,000 feet, every breath is a conscious effort. Your lungs burn with a dry, thin heat, even as the frost crystallizes on your eyelashes. You are tired in a way that sleep cannot fix, a bone-deep exhaustion born from humping 80-pound packs up vertical switchbacks. Most of the time, the biggest threat is a twisted ankle or a sudden case of altitude sickness. You focus on the small things, the weight of your rifle, the temperature of your canteen, and the distance to the next ridge. But sometimes, the mountains offer up something that a standard safety briefing cannot cover. Welcome to Waveborne Command. I have spent my fair share of nights in the tree line watching the shadows stretch and shift. You learn to trust your senses because they are all you have to keep you alive in the bush. But what happens when those senses start reporting things that shouldn't exist? In the military, we are trained to be observers. We categorize, we identify, and we report. We look for the thermal signature, the break in the vegetation, or the mechanical glint of a lens. We are taught that every sound has a source and every shadow has a shape, but there are moments in the field when the training fails to provide an answer. Moments when the silence of the woods becomes suffocating, and you realize you aren't the only thing moving in the dark. That is the moment when boredom turns into a primal, ice-cold terror. Was it just the fatigue of a 20-mile movement? Was it a trick of the moonlight on the granite faces of the canyon? Or was there something actually watching from the rocks, waiting for a lone sentry to blink? These are the questions that haunt the smoke pits and the barracks long after the exercise is over. The gray veil that settles over the valley floor marks a boundary between the world we map and the world we fear. To step into the mist is to leave the safety of the known behind. You must decide for yourself what is real as we pass into the fog of war. To understand the events that took place at Landing Zone Owl, you first have to understand the environment of Bridgeport. It is a place of extreme beauty and extreme hostility. The Marine Corps uses this terrain because it breaks people down, stripping away everything but their core instincts. The units that rotate through here, like the 1st Combat Engineer Battalion, are rugged and professional. These are Alpha 2 Marines, men trained to build, to destroy, and to survive. They aren't prone to flights of fancy or ghost stories. They are practical men who deal in steel, explosives, and sweat. In September and October, the mountains begin to transition. The days are still deceptively clear, but the nights drop into a brutal, unforgiving freeze. It was during this transition that a platoon from the 1st CEB found themselves established near a tactical landing zone known as LZ Owl. Before any unit begins their mountain training exercise, they are given a series of mandatory medical briefings. The Corps is very thorough about the physiological risks of high-altitude operations. They tell you about the dangers of dehydration and the signs of hypothermia. They especially warn you about the brain. High-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, is a terrifying reality for anyone working above 8,000 feet. It happens when the brain begins to swell from a lack of oxygen. The symptoms start with a simple headache or a bit of coordination loss, but it can quickly escalate into something much more disturbing. HACE can cause vivid, terrifying hallucinations. It can make a soldier see figures in the trees or hear voices in the wind. The command staff at Bridgeport makes sure every Marine knows this. If you see something strange, the official explanation is always that your brain is failing you. Then there is the Animal Packers course. This is a real operational part of the base where Marines learn to use mules and donkeys. These animals move through the brush at night, making strange, heavy sounds that can startle an inexperienced city kid. It is the perfect rationalization for any bump in the night. Between the threat of altitude-induced psychosis and the presence of pack animals, there is always a logical reason to ignore the unexplained. You tell yourself it is just the HACE talking. You tell yourself it is just a stray mule wandering away from the stables. It is a comforting lie that keeps you from looking too closely into the dark. But the Marines of the 1st Combat Engineer Battalion were about to encounter something that did not fit the medical pamphlets. They were about to see a figure that no donkey could mimic and no hallucination could leave physical evidence behind. They were about to learn that some things in the Sierras are older than the core. It began with a sound that every infantryman recognizes in his sleep. It wasn't the heavy footfall of a bear or the light scamper of a deer. It was a sharp, metallic click. It was the unmistakable sound of a rifle's charging handle being pulled back and released. That sound is a call to action. It is the sound of a weapon being readied for a fight. When that noise cuts through the silence of a mountain LZ at midnight, it doesn't matter how tired you are. Your adrenaline spikes, your heart hammers against your ribs, and your hand goes straight for your own sidearm. But when the sergeant on watch turned his head toward the source of that sound, he didn't find a fellow Marine. He didn't find an enemy combatant or a lost hiker. He found a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight from behind a jagged rock face. They weren't animal eyes. They were set in a head that was pale, hairless, and hauntingly human. It was the kind of sight that makes you doubt your own sanity, even as your training screams at you to engage. But before a word could be shouted, the figure vanished into the shadows of the granite. The next morning would bring the physical proof that something had been in their camp. Heavy gear, anchored by stones and steel, would be found sabotaged in a way that defied simple explanation. The mystery of the pale crawler was just beginning to unfold in the high mountain air. We have to ask ourselves, was it truly the thin air playing tricks on a weary mind? Was it a local legend manifesting in the stress of the moment? Or is there something truly unnatural stalking the training grounds of our nation's elite? The truth remains hidden somewhere within the fog of war. The high desert air in Bridgeport is deceptive. It feels crisp and clean, but for the 1st Combat Engineer Battalion, it was the backdrop for something far more sinister. We were stationed at Landing Zone Owl, a remote patch of ground used for the Mountain Warfare Training Center's most grueling exercises. It was late September, and the season was turning. The wind had a jagged edge to it that cut through standard issue layers. CPL Oscar and the men of Alpha 2 were focused on the mission, unaware that the terrain was watching back. Bridgeport isn't just about tactical maneuvers. It is a lesson in survival against the elements. The Marines were deep into a Combat Operations Center exercise, often referred to as a cool sea phase. This meant long hours, minimal sleep, and the constant pressure of simulated combat. At these altitudes between 7,000 and 8,000 feet, the environment itself becomes an adversary. You are briefed on the physiological toll, the way the thin air can warp your perception. But no briefing prepares you for a mechanical sound in a place where you are supposed to be alone. It happened during the dead hours of the night. A sergeant on the perimeter was holding watch, his senses dialed into the low hum of the mountain. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp, metallic clack, clack. It was the unmistakable sound of a rifle's charging handle being racked back and released. To a trained Marine, that sound is a universal signal of imminent violence. It is the sound of a weapon being readied to feed a round into the chamber. The sergeant's heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the darkness for the source. He expected to see a stray Marine or perhaps an instructor testing their security. Instead, his light beam cut through the dark to reveal a figure crouched by a rock face. It was bald, its skin a sickly, translucent white that seemed to glow under the LED. It was entirely naked, seemingly indifferent to the freezing mountain air that made the Marines shiver in their parkas. The most haunting detail, however, was the eyes. They caught the sergeant's light and reflected it back with a predatory, animalistic shine. The figure didn't stand up or flee like a human would. It ducked behind a boulder with a speed that felt wrong, a fluid, oily movement that bypassed the limitations of human joints. The sergeant scrambled to the spot, but the crevice behind the rock was empty. There were no footprints in the dirt, no signs of a struggle, and no trail to follow. The rest of the unit was quickly alerted, and the perimeter was tightened. They spent the remaining hours of darkness staring into the void, waiting for the metallic click to return. When the sun finally rose over the Sierra Nevada peaks, the true extent of the night's intrusion became clear. The heavy-duty tarps used for their shelters had been ravaged. These weren't just loose flaps caught in a gust of wind. The thick material had been torn down with deliberate force as if something had been trying to get inside. Even more confusing were the stakes. The metal rods that had been hammered deep into the rocky earth to anchor the gear were gone. They hadn't been kicked over or bent. They were completely missing from the site. To pull those stakes would require a human's grip and a significant amount of leverage. Yet there were no boot prints and no signs of a vehicle. The command tried to rationalize it, suggesting it was a prank or perhaps a localized weather anomaly. But the men of Alpha 2 knew what they had seen. They knew that a weather anomaly doesn't mimic the sound of a weapon system. In the military, we often look for the most logical explanation first. We talk about the branch break theory, which states sounds are often misidentified. A large limb snapping under the weight of snow or wind can sound remarkably like a mechanical snap. When you are sleep-deprived and on edge, your brain fills in the gaps with familiar threats. Then there is the matter of the altitude itself. At Bridgeport, every Marine is warned about HACE and HACE. High-altitude cerebral edema is a serious condition where the brain begins to swell due to a lack of oxygen. One of its hallmark symptoms is the onset of vivid, terrifying hallucinations. You see people who aren't there and hear noises that have no source. It is a convenient explanation for a sergeant seeing a pale man in the rocks. But HACE doesn't explain the physical damage to the equipment. It doesn't explain the missing stakes or the shredded canvas. Some pointed toward the local wildlife, specifically bears or mountain lions with sarcoptic mange. An animal suffering from mange loses its fur, leaving its skin wrinkled, pale, and emaciated. In the dark, a hairless bear could easily be mistaken for a humanoid creature. Predators like mountain lions are also known for mirroring target movements. They stalk a target from the brush and stop whenever the target stops. It is a psychological tactic used by hunters in the wild. But would a mangy bear rack a charging handle? Would it systematically dismantle a campsite without leaving a single track? The incident at LZ Owl remains one of those stories that circulates through the 1st Combat Engineer Battalion. It is a warning that the fog of war isn't always filled with human enemies. Sometimes it contains something that predates our presence on these mountains, something that understands our technology just well enough to mock it. As the Marines transitioned out of the mountains, many hoped the shadow would stay behind. They assumed the pale crawler was a local legend, a ghost of the high altitudes, but the phenomenon isn't restricted to the thin air of the California peaks. It seems to have a reach that spans the entire continent, appearing in places where the air is thick and the trees are old. The same emaciated silhouette would soon be reported hundreds of miles away. In 2014, the setting changed from the rocky heights of Bridgeport to the sprawling woods of Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. There, a solo soldier would find himself on a night-land navigation course, far from the safety of his unit. He wasn't suffering from altitude sickness and he wasn't looking for a fight. But in the intersection of the prairie and the forest, he realized he wasn't the only one navigating the dark. Something was perched in the trees, watching his every move with pinched, hungry features. The cadet didn't scream or bolt. Years of service in the National Guard had wired a disciplined response into his nervous system. He stayed perfectly still, his thumb hovering over the switch of his flashlight. The Wisconsin air was biting, and the silence of the prairie felt like a physical weight against his chest. High in the canopy of a rotted oak stump, the shape shifted. It wasn't the fluid movement of a squirrel or the heavy rustle of a common woodland raccoon. It was slow and deliberate. The moonlight caught a patch of skin that looked like wet parchment stretched over a cage of sharp ribs. This was the 2014 land navigation course at Fort McCoy. It was a solo exercise designed to test a soldier's ability to navigate through 60,000 acres of wilderness. Usually, the biggest threat in these woods is a twisted ankle or a disgruntled badger. But as the cadet adjusted his vision, he realized he was looking at something that defied local biology. The creature was emaciated. Its limbs were spindly and elongated, ending in fingers that seemed to wrap far too many times around the dark bark. Most disturbing were the facial features. He would later describe them as pinched, as if the creature's face had been collapsed inward toward its nose. It didn't have the snout of a canine or the flat face of a primate. It looked like a caricature of a starving man, stripped of all humanity and hair. The eyes didn't reflect the light like a deer's would. They seemed to absorb the shadows around them. 2 dark pits set deep into a narrow, angular skull. For several heartbeats, neither moved. The cadet felt the hair on his arm stand up, a primal warning that he had been downgraded from navigator to prey. He decided to break the stalemate. He adjusted his rucksack straps, making sure every movement was controlled and professional. As soon as he took his first step backward, the entity reacted. It didn't climb down the tree so much as it let itself fall toward the ground. It descended the 15 feet with a sickening silent speed. It landed on all fours, its joints clicking with a mechanical precision that made the cadet's stomach turn. This wasn't a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. The cadet was a former enlisted man who knew the difference between a shadow and a physical threat. He began to move toward the designated rally point, a paved tank trail about half a mile away. He kept his pace rhythmic, refusing to give in to the urge to run. That's when the mirroring began. Every time his boot crunched a dry leaf, a corresponding sound echoed from the thicket to his left. If he slowed down to check his azimuth, the movement in the brush slowed down too. It was maintaining a perfect parallel distance of about 20 yards. The cadet stopped dead in his tracks to test the theory. He held his breath, listening to the blood pumping in his ears and the rustle of the wind. A second later, the rustling in the tall grass stopped. Whatever was out there was following his lead, mimicking his tempo with unsettling accuracy. He flicked his light toward the noise, the beam cutting through the dense Wisconsin undergrowth. He caught a flash of pale, translucent skin disappearing behind a pine tree. The movement was low to the ground. It moved with a hitching, jerky gait, like a broken machine trying to keep up with a human stride. Panic is a soldier's worst enemy in the field. He focused on his breathing, counting his steps and keeping his eyes fixed on the shifting tree line. He knew these woods were supposed to be empty. Fort McCoy is a massive installation, but the Nightland nav sectors are strictly controlled for safety. There shouldn't have been any other trainees in this specific grid square, and there certainly shouldn't have been anyone out here without a uniform or gear. The pinched thing followed him for the better part of 20 minutes. It was a slow, agonizing psychological war of attrition in the dark. Every few yards he could hear the creature's limbs snapping small twigs. It wasn't trying to be silent anymore. It wanted him to know it was there. He reached a small clearing where the prairie met a wall of old-growth timber. The moonlight was brighter here, offering a moment of cold clarity. He turned his head just in time to see the creature crouched at the edge of the woods. It looked like a twisted piece of driftwood, white and weathered. It was watching him with an intensity that felt predatory. There was no curiosity in its stance, only a hungry, singular focus on the soldier. The cadet finally saw the paved road ahead, the asphalt shimmering like a black ribbon under the moon. He didn't wait for the creature to make the first move. He transitioned from a walk to a tactical trot, his gear jingling with every step. The sound in the brush became more frantic as the entity tried to maintain pace. He could hear the heavy, wet thud of the creature's palms hitting the earth. It was closing the distance, no longer content with just mirroring him from afar. As his boots finally hit the hard surface of the road, he spun around, raising his heavy flashlight like a weapon. The beam swept the edge of the pavement. There was nothing but the swaying grass and the dark shadows of the oaks. The creature had stopped at the very edge of the woods, refusing to step onto the open road. He stood there for a long time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence had returned, but it felt hollow and expectant. He made it back to the staging area and reported the incident to his instructors. He expected laughter or a lecture about being jumpy in the dark. Instead, he was met with a quiet, knowing look from one of the senior NCOs. They didn't confirm what he saw, but they didn't call him a liar either. Rumors circulate through Fort McCoy like ground fog. Stories of pale crawlers and emaciated figures have been part of the local lore for many years. Some soldiers think these entities are tied to the abandoned cemeteries scattered throughout the training areas. Old homesteads were swallowed by the forest when the base was expanded. Others point to more grounded, though equally disturbing explanations. They talk about the psychological effects of isolation and the glitches that happen when the human brain is pushed. But for the cadet, the physical reality of that night was undeniable. The sound of those clicking joints and the sight of that pinched face weren't products of stress. He had been hunted by something that understood his training. Something that knew how to stalk a soldier through the brush without ever being fully seen. This encounter at Fort McCoy shares startling similarities with the reports coming out of Bridgeport. Different terrain, different climates, but the same terrifying profile. A pale, hairless humanoid that moves with unnatural speed and displays a predatory interest in military personnel. It raises a question every witness has to face. Is it possible that our training environments are also the hunting grounds for something we don't yet understand? Or are we seeing the same monster across the country? To find the truth, we have to look past the fear and examine the harder facts. We have to look at the medical briefings and the biology of the wilderness. Because as strange as a crawler might be, the reality of what the human body can do under pressure is often just as frightening. Before we commit to the supernatural, we must consider the high-altitude warnings given to the Marines in California. The brain is a delicate organ that reacts poorly to a lack of oxygen. We have to weigh the accounts of these soldiers against the known symptoms of sickness and the strange behavior of diseased wildlife. The creature's skin wasn't just pale, it had a sickly, translucent quality that allowed the cadet to see the dark networks of veins beneath the surface. Every movement it made was accompanied by a wet, sliding sound. It was as if its muscle was rubbing directly against the bone. Yet, it was efficient. It never tripped over the uneven terrain, and it never lost its orientation, despite the pitch-black conditions of the Wisconsin woods. The cadet realized that whatever this thing was, it was perfectly adapted to the night. It was a specialist of the shadows, thriving in the spaces between the trees. The line between a physical threat and a neurological breakdown is thinner than most soldiers realize. And as we dig deeper, the Rake starts to look less like a ghost story and more like a biological mystery. If these sightings are truly hallucinations, we have to explain why they all share the exact same anatomy. Why does every soldier see the same pinched face and pale, elongated limbs? To find that answer, we have to look at the medical briefings given to every Marine rotating through the Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport. At altitudes between 7,000 and 8,000 feet, the human body begins to struggle with oxygen deprivation in ways that aren't always obvious. This isn't just about the physical strain of a heavy pack or the burning in your lungs. It is about a condition known as high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, which occurs when the brain begins to swell. Medical officers at Bridgeport warn that HACE can lead to severe confusion and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. When the brain is starved of oxygen, it often attempts to fill the sensory gaps with familiar or frightening shapes. If a Marine is already keyed up, expecting to see a threat in the shadows, his mind might manufacture one. But that doesn't fully explain why different units, separated by years, report the exact same pale, spindly figure. Then there is the auditory evidence, specifically the sound that CPL Oscar's sergeant described as a rifle's charging handle being racked. In the silence of the high Sierras, a single mechanical snap can sound like a call to battle. Experienced mountain guides often point to the branch break theory to explain this phenomenon. When a large, frozen, or dry limb snaps under its own weight, the sound is sharp, metallic, and sudden. To a trained ear, that specific frequency of snapping wood can be indistinguishable from an M4 being readied for fire. It triggers an immediate survival response, forcing the soldier's eyes to snap toward the source of the noise. In that split second of adrenaline and oxygen deprivation, the mind tries to make sense of what it sees. This is where the biological reality of the wilderness might be more terrifying than any ghost story. We have to talk about the physical state of the local wildlife, specifically predators like black bears or mountain lions. In the harsh wilderness, these animals are often ravaged by a condition called sarcoptic mange. Mange causes an animal to lose every scrap of its fur, leaving behind skin that is pale, wrinkled, and sickly gray. An emaciated bear standing on its hind legs, devoid of hair, looks remarkably like a distorted human. Its limbs appear unnaturally long and thin once the bulk of the fur is gone. Its movements, usually fluid, become jerky and erratic as the infection eats away at its nerves and strength. These animals are also known for a behavior called mirroring. which can be deeply unsettling for a lone soldier on a nightland navigation course. A hungry predator will often stalk a human from the brush. When the soldier stops to check his map or take a breath, the animal stops too. When the soldier moves, the animal moves, staying just out of sight but remaining perfectly synchronized with the human's pace. Imagine being at Fort McCoy, surrounded by 60,000 acres of Wisconsin timber, knowing something is following you. You stop, and the rustling in the leaves stops a heartbeat later. You look up and see a pale, hairless creature perched 15 feet up a tree stump, staring back with eyes that catch the light. Is that a sick animal, or is it something that shouldn't exist? This brings us to the distinction between the internet myth and the boots-on-the-ground reality. Most of you have heard of the Rake, a creature that has become a staple of modern horror folklore. The Rake has a very specific, documented origin, traced back to a collaborative writing project on an internet forum in 2005. It was designed to be a digital campfire story, a way to scare people through their screens. However, the term pale crawler has since been adopted by the paranormal community to describe sightings that predate the 2005 myth. These accounts come from hunters, hikers, and soldiers who have never heard of 4chan. They describe a hairless, grayish-white humanoid that moves with unnatural speed on all fours. Unlike the fictional Rake, these sightings often involve the creature interacting with the environment in physical, measurable ways. Think back to Landing Zone Owl at Bridgeport, where the heavy stone-anchored tarps were found torn down the next morning. The stakes weren't just pulled, they were missing entirely, as if something had deliberately dismantled the site. A mange-ridden bear might scavenge for food, but it rarely shows interest in organized demolition. It wouldn't systematically remove stakes and vanish into the tree line without leaving more obvious signs of a struggle. This leaves us in a difficult position as observers of the unknown. We can lean on the medical explanations of HACE and sleep deprivation to dismiss the sightings as products of a tired mind. We can point to sick wildlife and the trickery of snapping branches to explain the sounds and the shapes in the dark. These are the rational, logical conclusions that any professional investigator would reach first. But the consistency of the reports remains the primary obstacle to a clean explanation. When a Marine in California and a National Guardsman in Wisconsin describe the same pinched facial features, the coincidence feels thin. Both men were trained observers, taught to identify targets and navigate terrain under high-stress conditions. Their careers depended on their ability to perceive reality accurately and report it to their superiors without exaggeration. If we assume they are telling the truth, then we have to accept that something is inhabiting our training grounds. Something that knows how to avoid detection by everyone except the most isolated patrols. This isn't just about a creature in the woods. It's about the vulnerability of the men and women we send into those woods. They are trained to fight human enemies, but they aren't always prepared for the things that don't follow the rules of engagement. The psychological impact of these encounters can be just as damaging as a physical wound. A soldier who can no longer trust his own eyes is a soldier who is compromised in the field. As we move into our final assessment, we have to weigh the reliability of these witnesses against the impossibility of their claims. We have to ask if the uniform makes a witness more or less believable when the world turns sideways. The line between a tactical exercise and a descent into madness is thinner than any of us want to admit. And the most frightening part isn't the creature itself, but the silence that follows when you try to report it. That silence is where we find ourselves now, looking back at the after-action reports that never made it into the official logs. In the military, your reputation is your most valuable asset, and reporting a monster is a quick way to lose it. We have to consider the perspective of Corporal Oscar and the Marines of the 1st Combat Engineer Battalion during their time at Bridgeport. They are trained to identify threats and maintain situational awareness in some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. When a sergeant reports a humanoid figure with shining eyes ducking behind a rock, he isn't looking for a story to tell at the smoke pit. He is identifying a potential breach in security during a high-stakes mountain training exercise. This is a man who knows the difference between a mule from the animal packer's course and a bald, naked intruder. Yet when the sun rises, the only evidence left behind are torn-down tarps and missing heavy-duty stakes. We must address the physiological wall that every service member hits during operations at Landing Zone Owl. At altitudes reaching 8,000 feet, The body begins to react to the thin air in unpredictable and dangerous ways. Every unit rotating through the Mountain Warfare Training Center is briefed on the risks of high-altitude cerebral edema. This condition, known as HACE, causes the brain to swell, leading to severe confusion and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Was the creature at Bridgeport a result of the brain struggling to process reality in a low-oxygen environment? Or does the altitude simply peel back the layers of our perception, allowing us to see what is already there? The physical damage to the equipment suggests something more than a trick of the mind. Hallucinations do not typically pull out steel stakes or shred heavy canvas tarps that have been anchored with massive stones. Then we have the account from Fort McCoy in 2014, involving a former enlisted National Guardsman turned ROTC cadet. Nightland navigation is a rite of passage that tests a soldier's ability to remain calm while isolated in the deep woods. It is an environment designed to induce stress where every snapping twig sounds like an approaching enemy. But the witness in this case wasn't just hearing things. He was being actively mirrored by something in the brush. Predatory animals in the Wisconsin wilderness, such as mountain lions, are known for this specific stalking behavior. They will follow a hiker or a soldier from the tree line, stopping exactly when their prey stops to remain undetected. This mirroring is a calculated hunting tactic used by apex predators to gauge the vulnerability of their target. However, a mountain lion does not typically perch 15 feet up a tree stump with human-like facial features. We also have to consider the reality of sarcoptic mange, a horrific skin condition that can leave a bear or a coyote completely hairless. A bear suffering from mange becomes emaciated, its skin turning a pale, wrinkled gray that looks disturbingly like a sickly human. To a sleep-deprived cadet in the middle of the night, a hairless, starving bear could easily transform into a pale crawler. These biological explanations provide a tether to the world we understand, but they don't always cover every detail. There is a distinct difference between the digital folklore of the internet and the lived experiences of those in the field. The entity known as the Rake was born on a 4chan board in 2005, a deliberate piece of collaborative fiction designed to scare. But the reports of pale, emaciated humanoids often predate these internet stories or come from witnesses who have never heard of a creepypasta. We are left to wonder if the internet gave a name to a creature that soldiers have been seeing for decades. Fort McCoy itself is a place where the past and the present seem to overlap in the dense Wisconsin forests. The training area is home to abandoned 19th-century homestead cemeteries, forgotten by time but still marked by weathered stones. Soldiers moving through these woods at night are walking through a landscape filled with the echoes of those who lived and died there. It is a place where the atmosphere is heavy with the weight of history and the unexplained. Sergeant Lohman often noted that a large branch snapping in the cold can sound exactly like the mechanical rack of an M4 charging handle. For a trained soldier, that specific sound triggers an instant shot of adrenaline and a total focus on the surrounding darkness. When you are primed to hear the sounds of combat, the forest can become a very deceptive and frightening place. But it is the visual encounters, the ones that linger in the mind long after the rucks are dropped, that demand our attention. Why do these accounts of pale crawlers continue to surface across different branches and different decades of military service? Perhaps the isolation of a solo land navigation course, or a remote landing zone, provides the perfect conditions for an encounter. These are moments when the noise of the modern world is stripped away, leaving only the soldier and the ancient silent woods. In that space, the line between what is scientifically possible and what is personally witnessed begins to blur. We should respect the courage it takes for these witnesses to come forward with their stories despite the potential for ridicule. Their accounts remind us that even with all our advanced technology and thermal optics, there are still corners of the earth that remain dark. The uniform provides a sense of security and structure, but it cannot protect a person from the mysteries that dwell in the fog. These stories are a vital part of the military experience, representing the hidden history of the men and women who serve. As we close this after-action report, we are left with the same question that haunts every witness of the unexplained. Was it the result of high-altitude sickness, sleep deprivation, and animal misidentification? Or did these soldiers truly see something that doesn't belong in our world? The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle, hidden in the shadows just beyond the reach of our flashlights. We may never have the definitive proof we crave, but the consistency of the reports speaks for itself. I hope these accounts of the unknown help you realize that you aren't alone in your experiences, even the ones that defy logic. If you have had an encounter during your service that you've kept hidden, I encourage you to share it with our community. Please like this video and subscribe to Waveborne Command to ensure we can continue to document these strange and forgotten chapters of military history. Your support allows us to keep the watch and bring these stories out of the darkness and into the light. Thank you for listening and for your commitment to uncovering the truth behind the mysteries of the battlefield. May God be with each and every one of you, no matter what you are dealing with, and I will see you in the next episode.